report.
My task was to do a brief book report type report on the content of these various chapters. This chapter, I'm afraid I can't be very brief. This is loaded, loaded, loaded. I'm not going to be able to stop and make any applications to anything, partly because that was not the task I was given, but partly because it just simply isn't time. So, chapter 5, I'm sorry. The core issues reviewed in this section, or there are 5 sections. Dialogue that needs to take place in the international community, in national and local issues, and a dialogue about transparency in decision making. We really don't know all that much about how decisions are made that affect our life profoundly. Did anybody stay up and watch the House last night? Democrats took over the well of the House. That's not it. But if you did, keep that in mind as you hear what the Pope says about the public involvement, citizens' involvement in environmental issues. Okay. No, you got to stick to the text. There ain't time. Okay, politics and economy and dialogue for human fulfillment, and religion in dialogue with science. Those are all the things he's going to cover in this one chapter. So, first of all, I got to do this, don't I? First of all, dialogue on the environment in the international community. Well, his point is this is our common home, so all solutions proposed must be not simply to defend the interests of a few countries. The interdependence that we have obliges us to think of one world with one common plan. Individual countries cannot accomplish this alone. Therefore, such things as the use of fossil fuels needs to be progressively replaced without delay. World summits on the environment have simply not lived up to expectations because of lack of political will. Progress has been stymied by, quote, countries which place their national interests above the global common good. I mean, the guy ain't pulling any punches. Paris flopped. Why? National interest trumped the international common good. I thought I wasn't going to comment. Okay, now this is going to cost money, but spreading the cost of reversing this trend evenly across all nations is not just, because the poorer nations could not afford their allotted share. So the cost has got to be borne by the mega polluters, not say, okay, we made this mess, but you all have to help us clean it up. Not fair. And this whole process of buying and selling carbon credits, it's a farce. Oh, well, we haven't cleaned up our environment, so I'll buy some of your credits so that I can keep polluting. Pope says crazy. Enforceable international agreements are urgently needed, he says. The problem is in mindsets and in the lack of agreement among national governments on the imposition of sanctions. They can agree to all this stuff, but if there isn't some sanction put on violating these agreements, it'll just keep going. Sorry. Okay. That's the one I want? Yes. Okay, nationally. So questions related to the environment and economic development can no longer be approached only from the standpoint of differences between countries. They also call for greater attention to policies on the national and local levels. So, what are these things? National and local issues, foresight and security, timely enforcement, regulatory norms, the elimination of corruption, effective responses to undesired side effects of production, and appropriate intervention where potential or uncertain risks are involved. Sometimes we had this earlier. Something seems like a good idea, so we do it without first looking at, well, what are going to be the side effects of this good idea that we had? Another thing, the Pope says laws ought to exist not only to avoid bad practices, but also to promote best practice. So you can't just forbid things. Laws ought to exist that said you've got to do this. And the laws should encourage new initiatives by individuals and by groups. The problem is that governments tend to want immediate results which do not upset the public. So what the Pope says the solution is statecraft rather than politics. We need statesmen and women, not just politicians. Now last night, I just happened to have the TV on last night when this thing started in the House of Representatives. And I thought I saw statecraft. Yes, they did a political move, but it was for the sake of statecraft. Okay, comments. Okay, the solution, true statecraft is manifest when in difficult times we uphold principles and think of the long-term common good. Statecraft. And politicians, Pope says, are often afraid to do what is right, lest they upset the electorate. Their re-election takes priority over everything else. Statecraft. Okay, but the Pope goes on and said, hey, there have been some successes. Am I caught up with me yet? No. Okay, back up. Okay, there have been some successes. In some places, local energy self-sufficiency has been achieved. Values of the indigenous peoples. They are able to instill a greater sense of responsibility, a strong sense of community, a readiness to protect others, and a spirit of creativity and a deep love for the land, that they are also concerned about what they will eventually leave to their children and grandchildren. That's the Pope's idea. And he says society, through non-governmental organizations and intermediate groups, must put pressure on governments to develop more rigorous regulations, procedures, and controls. Unless citizens control political power, national, regional, and municipal, it will not be possible to control damage to the environment. Citizens have to upset what's going on. He didn't say it that way. But then, okay. He says, truly, much can be done. So we got a little more positive here. More energy efficient and less polluting forms of production are being developed. Diminishment of raw materials used in manufacturing is happening. Improved transportation systems could make a great difference. Making buildings more energy efficient would be a big help. Developing a better waste disposal and recycling system would help. And diversified agriculture. Instead of mega farms where there's wheat, nothing but wheat for miles. Diversify. It protects the soil. It preserves the soil. Okay. Dialogue for a new national and local policies continues. Consistent efforts are required, first from the citizenry, and then from politicians who are committed to long-term goals. Citizens need to keep up the pressure on politicians. He says, to take up these responsibilities and the costs they will entail, politicians will inevitably clash with the mindset of short-term gain and results which dominates present-day economics and politics. He continues, a healthy politics is sorely needed, capable of reforming and coordinating institutions, promoting best practices, and overcoming undue pressure and bureaucratic inertia. I'm sorry about this. But you know what? This will not happen until we have politicians motivated by worthy goals and values and a profound humanism to serve. Then we might have the basis for a noble and generous society. Can I read that again? This will not happen until we have politicians motivated by worthy goals and values and a profound humanism to serve. Okay. The third dialogue that the Pope says needs to take place is it's got to be a dialogue and transparency in decision making. So what's the problem? He says, an assessment of the environmental impact of business ventures and projects demands transparent political. No, I can't. Oh, sorry. Transparent political processes involving a free exchange of views. On the other hand, the forms of corruption which conceal the actual environmental impact of a given project in exchange for favors usually produce specious agreements which fail to inform adequately and to allow for full debate. Corruption. Environmental impact assessments must be part of the plans from the beginning. These should be interdisciplinary, transparent, and free of all economic and political pressure. They should be linked to a study of working conditions and possible effects on people's physical and mental health, on the local economy, and on public safety. Quote, honesty and truth are needed in scientific and political discussions. These should not be limited to the issue of whether or not a particular project is permitted by law. For instance, concern about water contamination overrides any other assessment of environmental impact on a region, he says. Water is the best, the most important. Okay, continuing dialogue and transparency in decision making. If there just may be danger of a negative environmental impact in a project, that is enough to cause delay in going ahead, just because it might. Among other things, this means that profit cannot be the sole motive for continuing a project. Quote, the church does not presume to settle scientific questions or to replace politics, but I am concerned to encourage an honest and open debate so that particular interests or ideologies will not prejudice the common good. Close quote. Okay, fourth concern of this chapter, politics and economy in dialogue for human fulfillment. The economy should not rule politics, okay? Money should not rule politics. First principle. Just because it's profitable doesn't mean it's good or right. And technology should not rule economy. Just because we can do it doesn't mean we should do it. The absolute power of a financial system, close quote, which caused the 2007-2008 financial crisis, must make a firm commitment to reviewing and reforming the entire system. This current system, quote, has no future and will only give rise to new crises after a slow, costly, and only apparent recovery. The response to the crisis did not include rethinking out the outdated criteria which continue to rule the world. I mean, this guy is insistent that things need to change. Now, this is an area which I do not understand, but I can read it. Speculation in commodities. Okay, that's beyond my comprehension. But speculation in commodities on the part of financial institutions often assigns to some project a value that it doesn't really have. This frequently leads to overproduction and marketing of some commodities with unnecessary impact on the environment and with negative results on the regional economies. I hope that makes sense to somebody. I do not understand this speculation in commodities. It is the real, not the speculative, economy which makes diversification possible and helps companies to function well and enables small businesses to develop and create employment. The fourth point. Now, this is part of the fourth point. The environment is one of those goods which simply cannot be adequately safeguarded or promoted by market forces. Protecting the environment does not put money in anybody's pocket. Quote, it is realistic to hope that those who are obsessed, is it realistic to hope that those who are obsessed with maximizing profits will stop to reflect on the environmental damage which they will leave behind for future generations? And the answer is no. When people raise these kinds of questions, they're often accused of stifling progress. But a decrease in the pace of production and consumption can at times give rise to another form of progress and development. We don't have to do it now. Why don't we wait? So efforts to promote sustainable use of natural resources are not a waste of money, but an investment. Profitable ways of reusing and recycling contribute to this, making our cities more energy efficient will help toward human fulfillment. Lifestyle changes. We need to pay attention to the quality of life rather than of increasing production of things that are not at all needed. Seeking to produce consumer goods for a quick profit is, in human terms, less worthy and creative and more superficial. Now a more sober lifestyle, less consumption in the richer parts of the world could lead to more healthy growth in the poorer parts of the world. So what's progress? Sometimes progress is equated with the maximization of profits. Not so. Quote, put simply, It is a matter of redefining our notion of progress. A technological and economic development which does not leave in its wake a better world and an integrally higher quality of life cannot be considered progress. Quote, today, it is the case that some economic sectors exercise more power than states themselves. International corporations run the world. We elect government officials, but international business runs the world. But economics without politics cannot be justified, since this would make it impossible to favor other ways of handling the various aspects of the present crisis. The mindset, which leaves no room for sincere concern for the environment, is the same mindset which lacks concern for the inclusion of the most vulnerable members of society. You treat the environment bad, you're going to treat vulnerable people bad. So, what is this progress? A strategy for real change calls for rethinking processes in their entirety. For it's not enough to include a few superficial ecological considerations while failing to question the logic which underlies the present-day culture. A healthy politics needs to be able to stand up to this challenge. Quote, while some are concerned only with financial gain and others with holding on to or increasing their power, what we are left with are conflicts and spurious agreements where the last thing either party is concerned about is caring for the environment and protecting those who are most vulnerable. Agreements are made all over the place, but they're agreements made for the people's mutual advantage, not for the common good. Okay, religions in dialogue with science. In such case, quote, little room would be left for aesthetic sensibility, poetry, or even reason's ability to grasp the ultimate meaning and purpose of things. It is reasonable and enlightened. No, I'm sorry. Is it reasonable and enlightened to dismiss certain writings simply because they arose in the context of religious belief? Is it reasonable? Quote, any technical solution which science claims to offer will be powerless to solve the serious problems of our world if humanity loses its compass, if we lose sight of the great motivations which make it possible for us to live in harmony, to make sacrifices, and to treat others well. Technology is not enough. We need principles. We need religious principles. Believers themselves must constantly feel challenged to live in a way consonant with their faith and not to contradict it by their actions. Think about that. That's what the man said. Believers must constantly feel challenged to live in a way consonant with their faith and not to contradict it by their actions. The Pope says dialogue is helpful. Whoops. The majority of people living on our planet profess to be believers. This should spur religions to dialogue among themselves for the sake of protecting nature, defending the poor, and building networks of respect and fraternity. Quote, dialogue among the various sciences is likewise needed, since each can tend to become enclosed in its own language with specific specialization, which specialization leads to a certain isolation and the absolutization of its own field of knowledge. Quote, an open and respectful dialogue is also needed between the various ecological movements, among which ideological conflicts are not infrequently encountered. The gravity of the ecological crisis demands that we all look to the common good, embarking on a path of dialogue which demands patience, self-discipline, generosity, always keeping in mind that one of his phrases from a previous encyclical, realities are greater than ideas. Quote, the gravity of the ecological crisis demands that we all look to the common good, embarking on a path of dialogue which demands patience, self-sacrifice, generosity, and always keeping in mind that realities are greater than ideas. Okay, what we do is going to affect those who come after us. As I quoted yesterday, Doomsday predictions are no longer a joke. The planet cannot sustain our current lifestyle. It just can't. Only decisive action here and now can prevent impending catastrophes. So why don't we address the pressing issues? Well, the Pope says it's an ethical and cultural decline. An ethical and cultural decline. Rampant individualism, self-centered culture of instant gratification, impulsive and wasteful consumption, the inability to take into consideration the lot of the poor. What's needed? A renewed sense of intergenerational solidarity. That's mammoth in my opinion. And now I'm supposed to say, are there any questions, even when I believe I don't have any answers? Francis. Oops.
Do you think it would be a good idea for the province at chapter time to enter into a dialogue covering some of these issues that you presented? Like, what is a quality of life? What are we doing as a province or even as individuals that are harmful? You know, or do we, what in our own lifestyle do we need to let go of so that there is a greater access of materials and things for others? So a dialogue like that, with the goal of setting up some policy.
I think such a dialogue would be both interesting and profitable as long as it would not be undertaken with the thought that whatever we would decide to do or to stop doing was going to have an impact on the whole world. The point on all of these things for me is, what's the impact it has on me and my mindset? If we had a province full of people whose mindset was this ecological sensitivity, we might make a difference in our immediate, our immediate contacts. But the decisions that we might make about our lifestyle could be very profitable. But I got to be 77 years old and tried a whole bunch of things to change the world, and it hasn't happened. But I don't think that my efforts are therefore ridiculous or meaningless. I would love to see the day when every friar appeared at a conference like this bringing his own thermal cup, to be reused and to be washed and be taken home so that the hotel would not have to throw away all the styrofoam. Is that going to change the world? No. It might change the province somewhat, but it's still worth doing. Still worth doing. Okay, now. Someone else here? Marty, you do have your hand up? Microphone's coming your way.
I thought I heard you say that the Paris meeting was a flop. And I saw in many articles that people were genuinely pleased that so many countries signed on to this. So what's your take on that?
My take on it is what followed after, which is nothing. Nations signed on, but because, as the Pope said, there is no accountability and no ability of anybody to impose sanctions, the words were very nice, very, very hopeful actually, but because there's no teeth in it, it's not expected to have its desired effects. Obviously, this is all stuff that other people have told me. I don't know this from my own experience, but that's what I've been told.
The other complicating fact about that is that signing on to a treaty is different than ratifying a treaty. Ratification is required in order for it to become law. So here in this country, you'd have to have 2/3 of the Senate, which is controlled by a party that's not particularly favorable to climate change treaties, to ratify that in order to put it into force as a matter of U.S. law. And this is just an answer to your question about speculation in commodities. Think of Potawatomi Casino. And that's essentially what speculation on commodities is. It's a bet that a person places that the value of a commodity is going to rise or fall, and they place that bet, and then either reap the rewards or lose. And that's why, for example, you'll see a lot of advertisements now asking people to invest in gold because there's concern that the value of the currencies are going to decline because of economic problems.
Thanks.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you, John. In addition to the speculation on commodities has moved out of precious minerals and into agricultural products. Brokerage houses in the search for yield are now making bets on foodstuffs that they have no intention of using. They're just holding the contracts and waiting for a market move. And it used to be a contract between a middleman, a user, and a producer, but now banking houses and investment companies have moved into that field and have distorted the price-value relationships of not precious commodities, but basic commodities.
Why are you not up here doing this? Thank you very much. Did I get this kind of a sign?
Yeah, why don't we have Brian go and then we will ask questions.
Okay.
I think the main thing is that our whole economic system is making sure that the currency is fluid, that we have exchange of money, no matter what. One of the insanities is the derivatives market. That means if I invest in derivatives, I am betting that maybe you won't pay off your mortgage. Wow. I put my precious money that should benefit humanity to go to the Potawatomi in Wall Street. That's where the derivatives are. It's disturbing.
I did not understand the movie, but I deliberately got the movie The Big Short because I wanted to try to understand this. And they promised me that it would be both entertaining and informational. Darn it, I was neither entertained nor did I understand the information. But I guess it is a great movie.
Thank you.
We're going to quit now.
We're going to take a 10-minute break.
All right, was that okay?
today happens to be my wedding anniversary, and so somebody asked me yesterday what I was planning on doing on my wedding anniversary, and I said I plan to spend a good portion of the day with a group of Capuchin friars. They couldn't quite understand why I'd want to do that on my wedding anniversary. But I'm happy to be here. As was mentioned, I am the executive director of the Franciscan Action Network. We are an organization that is comprised of Franciscan communities, including your congregation, your province is a member, and John was one of the founders of the Franciscan Action Network. It's made up of friars, sisters, lay secular Franciscans, Episcopalian Franciscans, Lutheran Franciscans, ecumenical Franciscans, and Franciscan-hearted people. And we do work, we are 501c3, so we don't work on politics, but we do work in the political realm, where we try to bring the spirit of St. Francis and Clare into the political realm. We try to do that as much as we can. I'm going to talk a little bit, and I'm going to try to follow a little bit from the previous speaker, who did an excellent job. Actually, some of his quotes that he used are quotes I'm going to use, so you'll hear it twice. I'm going to talk a little bit about Laudato Si, and talk about it from the perspective of action, what it means to us, what we can do. And when I give these talks, I always start off by saying that Laudato Si, and this changes everything. And one of the reasons that I believe that Laudato Si changes everything is that I think it is one of the most important documents that has been written in our lifetime. It challenges us to rethink who we are in relation to all creation, but it also gives us hope for a shared future. And the other part of it is, unlike a lot of encyclicals that have been written in the past, which were written by the Pope to his brother bishops, Pope Francis in this document started out, and I'm sure you heard this previously this week, but he started out by saying, I would like to address to every person living on this planet. In this encyclical, I would like to enter into a dialogue with all people about our common home. To my knowledge, and you all would know better than me, I'm not a theologian, but to my knowledge, this is the first time a pope has written an encyclical which he addressed it to all people. So that in itself makes it different. That in itself makes it very unique. I always like to start off with my talks that I give and share this slide. It's an interesting slide. It's a slide of, I always mention it, this is what I think God views. When God sees the earth, this is what God sees. And I ask people, is there something missing in this slide? And what's missing from this slide, what's missing from this picture is, if you look at the United States and Mexico, there's no line across there that draws where the border is, or the United States and Canada, or any of the other countries. There's no line there that says this is the United States, this is Canada, this is Mexico. And so when we talk about the earth, we talk about our common home, we're not talking about the United States, we're not talking about Canada, we're not talking about Mexico, or any of those countries. I don't think God views the earth in that perspective. I think God views the earth as one whole, all of us connected. So I want to read this little quote. I just read this book, Beyond Apathy, A Theology for Bystanders, written by a woman, Dr. Elizabeth Basco, who is a Catholic theologian at Duquesne University. I'm not familiar with any of her work. I had never read anything by her, never met her before, and I stumbled upon this book a couple weeks ago. I actually sat down and read it in 2 days, and it just blew my mind when I read it. So she talks about in her book, to be a Christian is to take sides with those who are marginalized, dehumanized, and subject to violence. Whether we like it or not, neutrality isn't an option. In the face of violent activity, to hide behind the mirror of ignorance is to take sides with the powers that be. We see an awful lot of apathy going on in our country right now and in our world, but we see it in this country. We see a lot of, as she puts it, hiding behind the powers that be, hiding behind a mirror of ignorance. If any of you are ever in Washington, D.C., I urge people, my favorite place to go is the Holocaust Museum. I go there, it's not exactly the most uplifting place to be, but I go there for two reasons. One is it reminds me of why I do the work that I do, but also there's a wall in the Holocaust Museum. And on that wall, there's statements from people who were alive during the Holocaust, important people, senators and members of the administration and business leaders and religious leaders. And they all say the same thing. They all say, I wish I had done more. If I had only known, I would have done more. So I always tell people when I always close my talk, I'm not closing it now, but I tell people that I hope someday there's not a wall with your name on it and it doesn't say, you're not saying, I wish I'd done more, I should have done more. Excuse me. I hope that's not the case. So we're living in a time where there's a new spiritual narrative is emerging. And clearly, Pope Francis's Laudato Si is a key part of it. But I believe it started before. I believe the Pope Francis and Laudato Si is just a continuation of what started years ago. Many of you may be familiar with the whole Occupy movement, which started at Occupy Wall Street. And then it moved on, and there were cities all over the country where people were occupying sites. And I did, and I do a fair amount of traveling in my job. And during that period of time, I intentionally decided to stay at some of the Occupy sites. Whenever I was traveling into a city to do some work or give a talk, I would go and spend the night at the Occupy site, just to be with some of those folks. And I found that a very, very interesting thing about the Occupy sites. Every single one of them, and I stayed in New York and Chicago and San Francisco and Oakland and all over the country, every single one of the Occupy sites that I stayed at, when they occupied the site, the first thing they did was set up a space for prayer. So they set up in some of them it was just a little 8x10 area. Some they set up a tent, which was their space for prayer. But every single one of them had a space for prayer. People misunderstood the whole Occupy movement and thought of it as a political movement. And they couldn't get their arms around because they kept asking, what's this political message? What's the message we're trying to get out? When in fact, the Occupy movement itself was a spiritual movement. There wasn't a political message, it was a spiritual message. And if you did spend any time there and talk to some of the people that were involved, you got that sense of a connectiveness and of a spirituality among those folks. So the question I always ask is, are we becoming a sacred community? 2 years ago, the Franciscan Action Network with a number of other organizations put together what we called a fast for families. It was a 30-day hunger fast in Washington, D.C. Some of you may be aware of it. Some of you came and joined us in this fast. Excuse me. And it was a 30-day fast. We had tents set up on the mall. A group of us started on the first day. And as there were 6 of us on the first day that started the fast, as each day went by, more and more people came. At the end of the 30 days, there were over 200 people who had come and spent time in tent fasting with us. I myself did a 13-day hunger fast. Others did 23, 24 days. One of the things we did during this fast was we invited people to come and join us, and famous people came. People like Barack Obama came, and others. Religious leaders came to join us. Cardinal McCarrick came and joined us and spent the day with us in the tent. And he was talking to us, excuse me, he was talking to us about this spirituality, and he said as he walked in, he said, I have entered sacred ground here. I can feel the spirituality in this space. You created a sacred community here. And then he said, and now your challenge is to go and take this sacred community and create it all around the globe. Make every inch of God's earth become a sacred community. So we are living in this time of a spiritual regrowth. I really believe that we're in the middle of a spiritual rebirth. And so that asks the question is, what is our story then? What is the story we are telling? I often tell people that I believe strongly that we need to recapture our spiritual stories and tell them the way they were meant to be told. For too long and for too often, our spiritual stories are told in a manner where we belong with the power, with the people at the top, with the comfortable. And that's not the story of Jesus, and it's certainly not the story of St. Francis. So we have to think of what is our story. What is our story as individuals? What is our story as connectedness, as a community? And what is our story as a globe, as a people of Earth and a whole Earth? This is a quote from St. Bonaventure. The created universe as the fountain fullness of God's expressed being. As God is expressed in creation, creation in turn expresses the Creator. So we have to think a little bit about, are we expressing the Creator? When we go off and we do things like destroy the mountaintops so we can get access to cheap energy, are we really expressing the Creator? When we deny access to people from other lands to come to the United States, when we talk about we're going to build a wall, are we expressing the Creator? And I don't have to answer that question. You all know the answer to that question. Well, Francis said, humanity is not separate from the environment in which we live. Rather, humanity and the natural environment are one. I think that was Pope Francis. I forgot to write who said that. And so again, we have to consider ourselves as part of all of creation. It says in paragraph 87, when we see God reflected in all that exists, our hearts are moved to praise the Lord for all his creatures and to worship him in union with them. We sometimes, and for many of us, we look at it as ourselves as separate from creation, not part of creation. Excuse me, I'm catching a little bit of a cold and a cough here. Now, for many of us, and particularly for Catholics, this whole idea of care for creation and caring for the environment is not new. It didn't start with Pope Francis's encyclical. Pope Francis really brought it forth, but it didn't start there. Going back to 2001, the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops issued what they called a Dialogue for Prudence and the Common Good. At its core, global climate change is not about economic theory or political platforms, nor about partisan advantages or interest group pressures. It's about the future of God's creation and the one human family. And then going back even further, in 1972, Pope Paul VI said, indeed, there's a growing awareness that humanity and the environment are more inseparable than ever. So our work on caring for God's creation, our work on the environment is not anything new. In fact, when I give talks to people, I tell them that Franciscans, we've been at this for about 800 years. So welcome to our party. And we're really happy that some of you started joining us. And this really goes back. It's not something new. God spoke of this at the dawn of history. At the Noahic covenant, God said to Noah and to his sons with him, I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you and with every living creature that was with you, the birds, the livestock, and all the wild animals, all those that came out of the ark with you, every living creature on earth. So when God created the Noahic covenant, he didn't create it between God and man. He created it between God and all creatures, every creature. And I think the previous speaker mentioned this too from St. Francis of Assisi. If you have people who will exclude any of God's creatures from the shelter of compassion and pity, you have people who will deal likewise with their fellow humanity. Sister Elia Delia, who's a wonderful Franciscan sister, I think she may have spoken at some of your events in the past. She just came out with a book recently called Making All Things New. I have to tell you a funny story. I see Elia a lot when I'm in D.C. People always ask me, where can I go if I want to meet Sister Elia Delia? And I tell them, go to the 7 o'clock Mass at the Franciscan Monastery because she's there every day. So I was at Mass a couple weeks ago and she was there, and we got a cup of coffee afterwards, and I said to her, Elia, I loved your new book, Making All Things New. I think it's the best book you have ever written. And she said, really, why? And I said, because I could actually understand it. So either I'm getting smarter or she's writing things a little simpler for folks like me to understand. She said she wrote it simpler. So, the gospel, she said in that book, the gospel life is not a social agency of good works, but a life of mindful presence. And again, I just throw this quote up there because I really like it. It's by a priest from the 15th century. Given a choice between a folly and a sacrament, one should always choose the folly, because we know a sacrament will not bring us closer to God. There's always a chance that a folly will. It's really interesting. My pastor at my church in Connecticut will often say, I hope you're not coming to Mass on Sunday to find God. You should be coming to Mass on Sunday to celebrate God, to celebrate God's love, and to share your love for God with everybody else that's here in your community. But if you're coming here to find God, then you're really, really sadly going to be lacking. And I think this priest says it best of all. When, if there's a choice between a folly and a sacrament, choose the folly. That's where we find God, is in our weaknesses. I always tell people an interesting story. People ask me, I do a lot of work on interfaith work. People always ask me, how did you first get involved in interfaith work? And I tell them, well, when I was 12 years old, I would walk to Mass. The church we went to was about 4 or 5 blocks from our house. So every Sunday, my parents are Irish Catholics, had lots of children, and they drag us all to Mass. We all go to the 10:30 Mass on Sunday morning. And as we were walking there was an Episcopalian church right near it, and we'd have to walk by. And their service was always getting out right around the same time that we were walking by. And I noticed there was this really cute girl coming out every Sunday. And because I went to Catholic schools and she didn't live in a neighborhood, I had no idea how to meet her. So I went to my youth minister, who was a young priest, one Sunday, and I said, I've been reading this Vatican II stuff, and it talks about how we should be working together with other faiths. So I was thinking maybe we could do a pizza party or something with the youth group from the Episcopalian church so we could all get together. And he thought it was absolutely brilliant, best idea he had heard, contacted the Episcopalian church, and they set up this whole pizza party for our 2 youth groups. Also, I could meet this girl. So God uses us in our weakness as well as in our strength, and probably more in our weaknesses than in our strength. Psalm 24, it says, the earth is the Lord's and all that it holds. Think about that for a second. The earth is the Lord's and all that it holds. In 2012, the fracking industry created 280 billion gallons of radioactive toxic wastewater. That's 280 billion gallons in 1 year of radioactive toxic wastewater. And we think about that as the earth is the Lord's and all that it holds. My friend Naomi Klein wrote this in her book, This Changes Everything. What if global warming isn't only a crisis? What if it's the best chance we're ever going to have to get to build a better world? Change or be changed. So it really is. Pope Francis talks about this. Naomi Klein talks about it. Brian McLaren wrote a book about change. Ilya wrote a book about change. We're in this period of time when everything is changing. Naomi's an interesting person. If you have a chance to read her book, This Changes Everything. Last year I was invited to a conference at the Vatican, and Naomi was there too. She and I had dinner in Rome, and she wrote an article about her appearance at the Vatican. She was asked to speak at this conference, and she called it a radical Jewish feminist at the Vatican. And the fact that Pope Francis and the Vatican would invite somebody like Naomi Klein to come and speak at the Vatican just talks about how much our church is changing, how much the world is changing. Previous popes would have never invited Naomi Klein to come and speak at a conference at the Vatican and come and meet the Pope and have a chance to have a private meeting with the Pope. So in paragraph 202 of which you're going to be hearing about more tomorrow, but it says, many things have to change course, but it is we human beings above all who need to change. You need to think about that for a second. St. Bonaventure tells us that how we choose and what we choose makes a difference. First, in what we become by our choices, and second, in what the world becomes by our choices. And every choice we make affects all of creation, everything. I know that the friar was talking earlier about bringing every friar bringing their own coffee cup, their own thermal cup to meetings. I have a water bottle that I take everywhere with me so that I don't have to use plastic cups. I do bring my own thermal cup if I'm going to a meeting for that various reason. Those are simple choices that we make that can affect the entire world. I want to show this real quick video. Hopefully it'll play. And then again, maybe it won't. Doesn't look like it's going to play. So I'll just actually read then. This is a poem that was written by a person. He does a much better job of reading it than I do. But I'll read this poem to you. It's called, What Did You Do? It's 3:23 in the morning, and I'm awake because my great-great-great-grandchildren won't let me sleep. My great-great-great-grandchildren ask me in dreams, what did you do while the planet was plundered? What did you do when the earth was unraveling? Surely you did something. When the season started falling, surely you did something. As the mammals and reptiles and the birds were all dying, surely you did something. Did you fill the streets with protest when democracy was stolen? What did you do once you knew? It's a great poem. I can actually send you the link to that if anybody wants to see. As I said, the author does a much better job than I do of reading it. Pope Francis tells us that we're losing the attitude of wonder, contemplation, listening to creation. The implications of living in a horizontal matter is that we have moved away from God and we no longer read God's signs. Men and women are sacrificed to the idols of profit and consumption. We live in a culture of waste. And so Pope Francis calls for a bold cultural revolution. Just think about that. He said that in the encyclical. He's also said that on some of his talks that he gives around the world. Think about that. When's the last time, first of all, a pope called for a bold cultural revolution? And what does that mean when he calls for a bold cultural revolution? He's certainly not calling for a revolution with guns and with fighting. I believe what Pope Francis is calling for is a revolution of spirit. The revolution, and as I said earlier, we're living in a spiritual reawakening. And that's what the Pope is calling for us for. It's a revolution of how we see ourselves in relation to all of creation and to God. And really the question that I ask people is, do you see yourself as being separate from creation, or do you see yourself as being one with God and with all creation? And so, we heard the poem about what did you do, and that begs the question, what is action? There's a lot of different ways that we can do action. For me, I do civil disobedience on a regular basis. If any of you are interested in coming down and getting arrested with me, you're welcome to. I was arrested a couple of weeks ago at a Democracy Awakening action. I have to admit that one wasn't too tough. They processed us, let us go, and then Ben & Jerry's had an ice cream truck out in the front of where we were being processed, so we got free ice cream after we were arrested. But that's a way. I wrote a blog recently about why, for me, being arrested is a form of prayer, and it's how I practice my faith. But that's not for everybody. Not everybody's called to do that. Others are called to do other things. And mostly what we're called to do and what our action is our lifestyle. And how do we change our lifestyle? How do we change who we are? And it's not just about changing light bulbs. It's how do we view ourselves in relation to creation? Are we viewing ourselves as separate from creation or part of creation, one with creation? Richard Rohr often talks about it, and he says, do you think when Jesus came, he came with a building plan or an evacuation plan? Because most of what we talk about, most of our theology is based on an evacuation plan, and most of what Jesus talked about was based on a building plan, building the kingdom of heaven. And so, are we really being expressions of the love of God, being expressions of God? Again, very truly I tell you, whoever believes in me will do works I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these. I often ask people, I often say, someday I'm going to go to St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, and I'm going to make sure it's when Cardinal Dolan is saying Mass, and in the middle of Mass I'm going to get up and I'm going to say, today is the day I'm going to do greater things than Jesus did. And I'm going to see what happens. Because that's what this says from John 14, that you can do even greater things than what Jesus did. And that's what action is to live our life of the gospel. live the radical demands of the gospel. As St. Francis, we don't know whether he said this or not, but he's credited with it, is to preach the gospel, but use words only when necessary. Perhaps one day, our world won't be upside down, and then any newborn human being will be welcome, saying, welcome, come in, enter. The entire earth will be your kingdom. Your legs will be your passport, valid forever. You know, if we all thought of ourselves as connected as part of the one, then we would actually believe this. This is another video, but I'm not going to be able to show this either. This video, and again, I'll send a link to it because you may want to view it. The video that we put together through the Global Catholic Climate Movement, which I helped form. I'm one of the co-founders of it. It falls under the auspices of the Franciscan Action Network. And they produced a video with Catholics from the Global South, including a number of Franciscan friars, pleading with Catholics from the Global North to change, to do something, to take action. So it's a great video. It's about 4 minutes long, but unfortunately it doesn't seem to be working in this technology. So we all know this, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We pray this prayer every single day. It's the most frequently prayed prayer among Christians. But do we ever actually sit and think about and meditate on what those words mean? Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. I tell people often, I ask the question, do you think in heaven that God will find it acceptable or do you think in heaven that there'll be people living in garbage dumps while at the same time other people are living in mansions? Do you think in heaven that we'll be destroying mountains and polluting our water so we can have access to cheap energy? Do you think in heaven we'll be building walls so as to keep people out, or that there'll be people starving to death while others have so much food that they throw it away? And if we don't think that that's how it is in heaven, why do we think God would find that acceptable on earth? This from the Our Father clearly says that. So I always tell people that let us be a presence that disturbs. My pastor, sometimes at the end of Mass, will get up and say, I hope that I've made you feel very, very uncomfortable. I hope you're sitting there squirming in your seats. Because if you're not feeling uncomfortable, then I haven't done my job, and you need to find another church that makes you feel uncomfortable. He'll go on to say that we never transform in our comfort zone. We only transform when we get out of our comfort zone. So let us be that presence that disturbs. Let's disturb all of creation. Let's disturb all of society, however we can do that. Let's not, as we started off by talking about apathy, let's not be apathetic. Let's not worry that we're going to offend people when we challenge them. Let's do it. Jesus didn't worry about that. Jesus is a disturbing presence in society that says some are worthy of God's love and others are not. Jesus, when he turned the tables over in the temple, didn't worry about disturbing people. I often tell people we are never going to solve the world's problems. We are never going to change by sitting around holding hands and singing Kumbaya. We are only going to change through action. And also keep in mind that all of these issues that we talk about and we work on, and all of us together within the Franciscan family, whether it be immigration reform, human trafficking, climate justice, gun safety, gun violence, all of them are the same issue. They're all just symptoms of the same issue, and the issue is, are we in right relationship with God, and through God, are we in right relationship with all of God's creation? The answer, of course, to that is really no for the most part. You know, we often talk about how we are the body of Christ. We claim as Christians that we're part of the body of Christ. But most of us don't actually believe that. We don't believe it at all. If we believe that we were part of the body of Christ, we would never, ever, ever buy coffee that was made from beans that were picked by children who were sold into slavery. We would never eat chocolate that was made from cocoa leaves picked by children sold into slavery. We would never go and buy a blouse or a shirt at Walmart that was put together by women in Bangladesh who are living in slavery. We wouldn't do that if we truly believed that we were part of and we were one with the body of Christ. So let's step into the future. When you reach real ability, you will be able to become one with the enemy. Entering his heart, you will see that he is not your enemy after all. Let's really step into a future and start living a future of connectiveness. Again, as Ilia Delia talks about it, she calls it quantum entanglement. That's the future that we should be living in now. We should be starting to build that kingdom of heaven here on earth. We shouldn't be waiting to go someplace else to get to heaven. And one of the most beautiful things I believe about Laudato Si is, and about Pope Francis, is that Pope Francis gives us hope. And in Laudato Si, he says, hope would have us recognize that there is always a way out that we can always redirect our steps, that we can always do something to solve our problems. All it takes is one good person to restore hope. And so I'm going to end on that note. I'm going to really just ask all of you. I mean, I think to change, when Pope Francis talks about change, what Pope Francis is talking about changing how we view ourselves in relation to all of God's beautiful and wondrous creation. And do we view ourselves as being part of that creation? You know, we often hear the stories of St. Francis of Assisi, and as Franciscans, we share a lot of those stories. And one of the stories we hear a lot is of Francis going out and talking to the birds. And I read somewhere about how Francis was once asked by one of his brothers why he did that. And his answer was that God told me to preach the gospel to my brothers and sisters, and these are my brothers and sisters. So for Francis, all of creation, the animals, the birds, the trees, they were all part of the body of Christ. To be part of the body of Christ meant to be one with all of creation, to be a wholeness of being, to be connected, not to be separate from creation. So I ask that that's where we move forward in looking how we can do that first internally within our own selves, and then within our smaller communities, and then we'll bring about the change within the larger communities and the global. And what we'll really, really be doing then is we'll be building the kingdom of heaven here on earth. Thank you all very, very much. And I'll be happy to answer. I won't actually answer any questions, but I'll happy to field any questions.
Thank you, Patrick. We're going to open it up now, of course, to questions that you may have. Or comments.
I have a quick question for you really quickly. Can you hear me?
Could I just ask a favor? Could who's ever asking the question identify themselves also?
I just want to make sure you're not getting a lot of feedback when you hear yourself talk.
No, I'm good.
Okay, that's what I want to know. Thank you.
So I'm Brother Francis Dabrowski from Milwaukee. And my question to you is, as the Capuchin community, where would you suggest we start?
A couple of things on that. Again, as Franciscans, we have to start internally. So for each of you there, I would suggest you start internally and looking at yourselves, and how do you view yourself? You viewing yourselves as being separate from God's creation or part of it, and then looking within your smaller communities and looking at ways that you can become more energy efficient. You can, I tell people all over the place, every talk I give, a small thing that people can do is give up eating meat even one day a week. With the global Catholic climate movement, we're thinking of trying to start meatless Fridays again, kind of in our Catholic DNA. But eating meat is one of the main causes of climate change. And so stop eating meat or eat less meat. And I'm a vegetarian, so I also tell people, as keep it in good Catholic tradition. If some of you can't actually give up eating meat, I'll sell you one of my days. So, we'll call that a carbon footprint. But those are simple things that we can do. And then also not being afraid to go out, whether you're priest and preaching. It's fascinating to me. I saw a survey recently that a year after Laudato Si, more than 50% of Catholics in this country still haven't heard about Laudato Si from their pastor, from their priest. And so preaching about Laudato Si every Sunday, talking about it, at the Franciscan Action Network, we've incorporated Laudato Si into everything we do. Every press release that we have, we quote Pope Francis in it. Everything we do. So that's another way you can do it. But again, it starts with you individually as a person, and then in your small communities, and then taking that message out by living the radical demands of the gospel, which most of you are doing, but see how you can even do it more. That's it. No more questions.
I think that's it, Patrick. So thank you very much for your time and your input. We appreciate you chiming into it.
Thank you all. Thank you all for the work you all do.
Now, brothers, we'll take a break.